The Real Benjamin Franklin, Chapter 11, The Frontier General. While the Albany Congress of 1754 was still in session, a Virginia military force led by 22-year-old Colonel George Washington was forced to surrender Fort Necessity to the French, who had already captured another English stronghold at the forks of the Ohio and had renamed it Fort Duquesne. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, had now begun in earnest. Quite a few weeks passed before news of the incident reached Benjamin Franklin, but he had known for some time that hostilities were imminent. It was primarily for this reason that he deeply regretted the rejection of his Albany Plan of Union. The colonies, so united, he believed, would have been sufficiently strong to have defended themselves. There would have been no need of troops from England. But troops were sent from England, plenty of them. In February 1755, 2 regiments of British regulars arrived under the command of General Edward Braddock. Their assignment was to march over the mountains and recapture Fort Duquesne from the French. Most of the burden of supplying and transporting Braddock's army fell on Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Franklin, acting in his appointed role as deputy postmaster and manager of all His Majesty's provinces and dominions on the continent of North America, met with Braddock to confer on the details of these arrangements. He found the general at Frederick, Maryland, waiting impatiently for the return of those he had sent through the back parts of Maryland and Virginia to collect wagons. I stayed with him several days. When I was about to depart, the returns of wagons to be obtained were brought in, by which it appeared that they amounted only to 25, and not all of these were in serviceable condition. The general and all the officers were surprised, declared the expedition was then at an end, being impossible, and exclaimed against the ministers for ignorantly landing them in a country destitute of the means of conveying their stores, baggage, etc., not less than 150 wagons being necessary. I happened to say I thought it was a pity they had not been landed rather in Pennsylvania, as in that country almost every farmer had his wagon. The general eagerly laid hold of my words and said, "Then you, sir, who are a man of interest there, can probably procure them for us, and I beg you will undertake it." Franklin accordingly circulated an advertisement among the Pennsylvania farmers and hired a sufficient number of teams and wagons to transport the supplies overland. He advanced some of his own money to help make the initial rental payments which had been promised, and at the insistence of the farmers who did not know Braddock, he gave his personal bond to guarantee reparations for any horses or wagons which might be lost in the campaign. In conversation with General Braddock one day, Franklin cautioned him about a possible ambush by the Indians as the soldiers marched through heavily wooded areas en route to Fort Duquesne. He smiled at my ignorance and replied, "These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make any impression." I was conscious of an impropriety in my disputing with a military man in matters of his profession, and said no more. The general should have listened. During the overland march that summer, he failed to provide adequate reconnaissance for his advance, and the British troops fell victims to a surprise attack on July 9, 1755, only 9 miles from their destination. Braddock was seriously hurt. 63 of his 86 officers were killed or wounded, and 714 of the total advance force of 1,100 lost their lives. Several days later, Braddock himself died after uttering the words, "Who'd have thought it?" The soldiers who were not gunned down fled in panic, leaving the wagons, provisions, artillery, and many of the horses to the enemy. Thus, Franklin faced financial ruin because of the bond he had given. But Braddock's successor fortunately ordered reparation payments in October. With no British defense force to protect them after Braddock's defeat, the Pennsylvanians were terrified. It was obvious that an armed militia was urgently needed, but there was still official resistance to the idea because of the Quakers' pacifism. The Quakers constituted a majority of the assembly, though not of the population, and the continuing altercations between the assembly and the governor, now Robert Morris. Franklin, after making several preparatory moves to reduce resistance and conciliate differences, introduced a militia bill in the fall of 1755. It passed on November 25th, allowing the men of the colony to voluntarily organize into military units and elect their own officers. Franklin himself was appointed chairman of a 7-man committee to manage the defense funds appropriated by the assembly. After printing in the Pennsylvania Gazette an article explaining the militia plan, he set out for the frontier communities with 50 cavalrymen to establish a line of defense against the Indians and the French. Although he carried no military rank at the time, the citizens along the frontier called him General Franklin. Following an Indian attack on one of the settlements in January 1756, Franklin was instructed to assume military rule in Northampton County. I undertook this military business, he wrote, though I did not conceive myself well qualified for it. The governor gave me a commission with full powers and a parcel of blank commissions for officers, to be given to whom I thought fit. I had but little difficulty in raising men, having soon 560 under my command. My son was my aide-de-camp and of great use to me. For the next several weeks, Franklin personally supervised 130 soldiers and a company of skilled axemen as they erected 3 stockades in Northampton County, one of which was named Fort Franklin by the volunteer troops. The general at least pretended to enjoy life on the frontier despite his hard lodging. He wrote his wife several letters thanking her for the goodies she occasionally sent to him and the other soldiers. We have enjoyed your roast beef, and this day began on the roast veal. All agree that they are both the best that ever were of the kind. You are citizens that have their dinners hot and know nothing of good eating. We find it in much greater perfection when the kitchen is 80 miles from the dining room. Word came in February 1756 that Gouverneur Morris had called an early session of the Assembly and that Franklin was wanted back in Philadelphia. Satisfied with the completion of the 3 stockades, he turned his commission over to a Colonel Clapham, a New England officer experienced in Indian War, and returned to Philadelphia with his son William. Soon after their arrival, the officers of the Philadelphia regiment met and elected Franklin their colonel. The governor was not inclined to approve this commission, but members of the local militia demonstrated in front of his house and pressured him into doing it. On March 17th, an incident occurred which caused Colonel Franklin no small embarrassment. It was known that he was leaving for Virginia that morning on postal business, and the officers of his regiment took it into their hands that it would be proper for them to escort me out of town as far as the lower ferry. Just as I was getting on horseback, they came to my door, between 30 and 40, mounted and all in their uniforms. I had not been previously acquainted with the project, or I should have prevented it, and I was a good deal chagrined at their appearance, as I could not avoid them accompanying me. What made it worse was that as soon as we began to move, they drew their swords and rode with them naked all the way. Somebody wrote an account of this to the proprietor of the colony, Thomas Penn, and it gave him great offense. No such honor had been paid him when he was in the province, nor to any of his governors, and he said it was only proper to princes of the blood royal, which may be true for aught I know. Franklin afterward wrote of the incident. I, who am totally ignorant of military ceremonies, and above all things adverse to making show and parade or doing any useless thing that can serve only to excite envy or provoke malice, suffered at the time much more pain than I enjoyed pleasure, and have never since given an opportunity for anything of the sort. And that's the end of chapter 11.